have any worst case scenario people in the room? Worst case scenario? I'm a worst case scenario person. There's basically one area that I don't expect the worst case scenario, and that's in home projects or vehicle maintenance. I watched the video, and the video's only 15 minutes long. It can't be that bad. And 3 days and 6 Home Depot trips later, I'm never doing another project again until the next one. It's the only time I don't assume the worst. I don't know why I should assume the worst then. The rest of the time, I just assume it's going to be the worst it can possibly be. If you text me and say, hey, can we meet next week? It's going to be an awful week for me. It's just going to be awful. Because I'm not going to sleep that week, and I'm going to spend the whole time wondering what I did, why you're leaving, like why you think I'm ugly, like what's going on. I'm just going to assume the worst. And that's with a lot of things. Like anytime and that's when you don't even know about a problem. You don't even know that there's a problem. I'm still going to assume the worst case scenario. But when I actually have a problem with somebody, I know that there's a conflict. Then it's like, oh man, this is worse than worse. I didn't know it could get this bad. Everything's going to be terrible. And then I get into the actual situation, and like, turns out I had no idea what was going on. It wasn't that big of a deal. It worked out just fine. I think there's a lot of us, there might be a couple of people in here that are not worst case scenario people, but a lot of us are worst case scenario people, and we allow our imagination, our internal renderings of what's going to happen to keep us from doing things that we know we need to do. It's to keep us from extending forgiveness that we need to extend, from asking for forgiveness, from having conversations to resolve conflict, and we are so worried about the worst case scenario that we never deal with a problem, and then it actually grows into something when it wasn't something in the beginning. And our fear of the worst case scenario prevents us from obeying Jesus in ways that we know we need to. Jacob, we've been going through his life in Genesis, and he has been dreading a moment for 20 years. There's been a moment that it's really the climactic event of his life, and he is terrified of what's going to happen. So Jacob, if you've not been here in the past or not familiar with this story, Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. His dad Isaac was the one that was almost sacrificed on the mountain. And he's a twin, but he's the second-born twin. And he and his brother don't get along. Like, they don't get along to the point that while their mom was pregnant, she prayed and asked God, what is going on inside me? Because it's terrible. And God answered her. They don't get along so much, God answered her and said, yeah, they don't like each other. They're never going to. And he was right. They fight the whole time. And there's a point where Esau, who's the president of the drama club, is out and he gets so hungry he thinks he's going to die, and he comes back and Jacob is making bean soup, and he says, give me some of that bean soup, I'm about to die. And Jacob says, sell me your birthright, which is 2/3 of the share of the inheritance. It's spiritual authority, it's legal authority, it's all those things. He says, what do I care about inheritance? I'm about to die. Give me some of that bean soup, and he sells it. And very kindly, people call him Red for the rest of his life because it was red soup. That's what they call him. There's another moment a few years after that where Isaac, Jacob and Esau's dad, is going to try to make up for this by giving the oldest son this spiritual blessing. It's not the legal blessing, but it's a spiritual blessing, and try to fix that. But he's blind, and so Jacob and his mom come up with this scheme where he's going to pretend to be Esau and go in and steal the blessing, and he does that too. And Jacob finds out pretty quickly, because Esau is not making a secret about it, that Esau is planning to kill him as soon as their dad dies. And by not making a secret, I mean he's telling everybody very loudly. As soon as dad's dead, Jacob is dead. So Jacob runs off, and he's gone for 20 years. And in this 20 years, he finds out that life is hard away from home. And after 20 years, God tells him it's time to come home. And he is terrified, for good reason, that his brother is going to kill him, terrified about what's going to happen, terrified that his brother's still angry. But things have gotten so bad where he is that it's a choice between staying somewhere miserable or going somewhere miserable, and he chooses just to do the different one because God tells him to. So he goes, he's on his way home, and it's about a 500-mile trip. He's got 12 kids, he's got 2 wives, he's got 2 concubines. His favorite wife is pregnant with his 13th kid, and it's a rough trip as they come down with thousands of livestock and all these things. And he sends some guys to go and find out like how Esau's feeling. Just go get a read on his mood. And he sends them, and they go and they tell Esau, hey, your brother Jacob's coming. How do you feel about that? He doesn't really say anything, but he gets 400 soldiers together and kind of assume the worst from that. So the servants run back real fast and say, hey, we told him, and he's coming with 400 armed soldiers. So Jacob assumes the worst, and I would assume the worst in this moment too. Jacob spends the night in prayer. He ends up wrestling with an angel, and when he gets done, he now has to deal with the worst moment of his life. At least the moment he's been dreading the most, the moment that he's not slept over for 20 years. He has to just finally suck it up and have this conversation that he has put off. And you know what that feels like. Yeah, can you feel that in your stomach? You know what that feels like? That the dread that comes from that conversation, leading up to that conversation. Like you're brushing your teeth, thinking about that conversation, and you're brushing your hair, thinking about that conversation. You're driving, like you stop to get gas, you never fill up the tank, but it's at half, so you better stop and get gas now just to have a few more minutes to delay it, and you can feel what that's like. And that's the moment that Jacob is walking into in Genesis chapter 32. It's Genesis 33. I messed up my slides again. But in Genesis 33, we get this moment. I just want to read through this and talk to you about this moment where he has the worst case scenario planned out in his mind. In Genesis chapter 33, verse 1, it says, Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So you've got the dust cloud in the distance, and you can see them approaching. So he divides the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants. And he put the servants with their children in front, and Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. Now Jacob has made a lot of progress, but just in case you think he's a great guy, he divides his families up and puts the concubines, who he doesn't really care about, and their children in the front. And then he puts his second favorite wife right after them with her children, and then his favorite wife last with her children. And the reason he did that is because if Esau gets there and kills the first group, the others will have time to run. That's what he does. The only decent thing he does, it's got to feel good though, right? It's got to feel good to have your dad rank you. Like the wives know where they stand, they understand this. But the children are like, yeah, dad loves me just the same. Why are we in the front again? I don't. If you want some criticism of him over that, you can go back a couple of sermons online and watch that. But the only decent thing he does is he makes this staggered order of least favorite to favorite, and then he goes in the front. So at least if somebody dies, he dies first. So I can applaud him for that, if nothing else. So he's got everybody staggered out, and part of me wonders if he didn't stagger them partially because he wants this, the protection, but partially because he's just delaying something else to delay. And now he can't delay anymore, and he walks out to the front to die. He walks out in the front for his brother to kill him, and hopefully his brother will be satisfied with just murdering him and not his children, not his wives. And then in verse 4, Esau ran to meet him. Like he's running at him, like, oh boy, how's this going to go? He runs to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. When Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, who are these with you? Jacob said, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. We imagine these worst case scenarios, like this is how it's going to go, this is how it's going to be, this is what's going to happen. And we get there, and almost every time, it's like popping a balloon and all the air comes out, and like it's nothing. this moment that we dread, this moment that we fear, this moment that we build our lives around avoiding, when we're finally forced to face it, it's almost never the worst case scenario unless it's home projects. It's almost always better than we think it's going to be. And this thing that we take years off our lives worrying about and dreading, and we lose sleep, and we cause fights in our family because we're dreading this thing that we know we need to do, but we're so afraid to do. When we finally do it, that wasn't even that big of a deal. In fact, I feel better. It was good. It worked out. It's almost as if obeying God makes things better rather than worse. Almost. We spend years knowing what God wants us to do, knowing the conversation God wants us to have, and we disobey God because of our fear of what we are creating in our imaginations. I got to say, I really think the root cause is just a lack of trust in God. God says to do this. We're afraid of what's going to happen, so we don't do this. We don't believe that God can take care of us through that. We don't believe that God's going to get us through this. We don't believe that God's going to just carry us through, even if it is the worst case scenario. He's going to carry us through. Jacob didn't believe, but he knew he had to, so he went and did it. But yet, God knew that this was the perfect moment for this. God knew that Jacob was not the only one that had grown. Jacob was not the only one that had changed, but that Esau had grown and changed. He wasn't the same person he was before. And when God said to go do it, it wasn't just God saying, you got to obey me, go do that thing, it's terrible, go do it. But it was God saying, this is going to be the best thing for you. I know what's going on with the other person, you don't. You think you know everything, you're just imagining things. You're just making all this stuff up in your head. You don't know what they're thinking. You don't know what they're going to do. I do. Now is the right time to do this. And we say, no. No, I'm scared. No, I'm not going to obey you. And then when we finally do it, it's so anticlimactic. It's just like almost a letdown how easy it goes when we choose to obey God. Rather than telling God He's not trustworthy, telling God that we know better, telling God that our imaginings of what's going to happen are more valid than His foreknowledge of the future. And Jacob, this is almost boring. This story is almost boring because there's all this buildup about what's going to happen, and there's all this dread and all this worry, and then he gets there and they just hug and cry. Esau said, what do you mean by all this company that I've met? He had sent 580, if my count is right based on how they did it, 580 pieces of livestock ahead of them. He sent a group of camels and a group of sheep and a group of goats so that Esau would be wealthy by the time that they even got there. He sent him his gifts, hoping that if Esau was mad, he would be done being mad by the time he was rich, just from the presents that Jacob had given him. And he said, what are all these animals? He said, I gave them to you. Jacob answered, said, I gave them to you to find favor in the sight of the Lord. And what's crazy to me about this is how much things have changed. Because the whole reason they fought was out of greed. The whole reason that they fought was over who's going to get the inheritance, who's going to get the wealth, who's the one that's going to be rich, who's the one that's going to be blessed. And they fought over this thing. And now that they're back together, now that they've grown and now that they've matured, they value their relationship more than they value the thing that they ever fought over. This thing that has separated them from 20 years, no, they don't even want that anymore. They don't even care about that anymore. They just want each other back. Jacob has gone from stealing from his brother, lying to his dad, taking advantage of his brother, to saying, here, take a fortune, please. Please take this wealth. Esau said, I have enough, brother. Keep what you have for yourself. And Jacob said, no, please. Now they're fighting over who's going to get the money in the opposite direction. If I have found favor in your sight, then please accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you've accepted me. This I have seen your face. This is such a weird thing to say because we don't say stuff like that. But here's what I want you to think about, okay? He says, please take this wealth because all I wanted was you back. And I've got you back, and I don't care about the rest. Take the rest of it. I wanted you back, and now I've got you back. I value the relationship over the stuff. I value the relationship over the fight. I value the relationship over the inheritance claims. I wanted you back. In seeing you, it makes me so happy. It's like I got to meet God in person. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you. Because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have enough. Accept my blessing. This blessing that they fought over, this blessing that he lied over, this blessing that he stole over, said, I want to bless you. I'm not looking for the blessing for myself. I no longer feel like only one of us can be blessed. Take it. I want to bless you. Thus he urged him and he took it. Then Esau said in verse 12, let us journey on our way, and I will go ahead of you. But Jacob said to him, my Lord, and I want you to just think about the titles of respect that he used. That'll come up again in a minute. This titles of respect, the way that he talks to his older brother. He's never shown respect to his older brother. He's always been angry with his older brother about the fact that his brother is his older brother by a couple of seconds. But throughout this conversation, his attitude is completely different. He says, my Lord. He calls them your servants. Which, by the way, is the proper hierarchical position for them in this culture. It's the respect that should have been showed in the first place. I'm not saying you have to go call your older brother my Lord. Joey, my little brother, should, but nobody else has to do that. But in their culture, what is deserved, what is looked for, what Jacob should have been doing is showing this same respect. And he says, I'm not going to mess this up again. I'm going to show you respect. My Lord, you know that the children are frail and that nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, the flocks will die. Esau says, let's go. Come on, we're going back home. I'm going to go ahead of you. We're going to drive everybody back. We're going to get there. We're going to see Dad. Mom, we believe she has died at this point, but we're going to get back and see Dad. Let's go. And Jacob says, no, I can't do that. I've got the young animals. I've got the young kids. If we drive them hard like that, they're not going to make it. He said, instead, let's do this. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant. He's pouring it on thick here. And I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me and at the place of the children until I come to my Lord in Seir. So Esau said, let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. Let me just leave you some guards. It's a dangerous area. Let me leave you some of the guards. And he said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, but Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the name of the place is called Succoth. Now, he lies to Esau a little bit here because what Esau wants him to do is come home. And he says he's going to come home, sort of. But instead of going home, he sends Esau's people away and he goes and sets up his own camp somewhere else. Now, why did he do this? There's two good reasons to do this. First of all, he is the one that has the right of inheritance. He is the one that has the family blessing. He is the one that gets to act legally as the older brother. And Esau doesn't have an inheritance anymore, right? They didn't swap inheritances. He bought his. If Jacob goes home, Esau loses his. Because he's given away his inheritance, he's given away everything. And he stayed with mom and dad for 20 years. He's the one that took care of mom and dad for 20 years. His wives took care of mom and dad for 20 years. He is the one that has done this. And if he goes home, then he pushes Esau out. And Esau says, no, I want you to come home. But if he goes home, his brother loses his. And the kindness that he shows to say, we're not going to go where we know where the good water is. We're not going to go where we know where the fields are. We're not going to go, and I'm not going to take up my inheritance and my rights there. But instead, we're going to go somewhere else so that you can keep that for a while, is kindness that he never showed to his brother before. But the second really good reason not to go home is because they are still, though they have grown and they are changed, they are still the same people. And those fights that they had before, if they spend too much time together, they're probably going to have them again. You know how that is, right? You and your brothers, you and your sisters, you don't get along until you move out of the same house. And once you get out of the same house, like, you get to be friends. When you don't have to see each other's stupid faces every day, you can be friends. You can get along. When you're not sharing a bathroom, you can get along. And then you're away from each other and you come together over the holidays, and maybe there's a funeral or maybe it's a holiday, and you spend a week together. And the first couple of days are really good, and what happens after a few days? Those same problems that you had before come up again. And Jacob, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. What Jacob has figured out is that you got to have some boundaries in your life. If you want relationships to continue, if you want to continue to get along, you got to have some boundaries. And Jacob says, look, for your sake, for my sake, for the sake of our relationship, we're going to put a line between us. And I still want to see you. I still want to hang out with you. I just don't want to do it every day. Because if we do it every day, we're not going to get along. And he drew this line of distance between himself and his brother to protect the relationship that he valued. And then he did one last thing. After they got camped, he gets into verse 18. And Jacob came safely to the land of Shechem, to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. I just want to point out something about these cities. Like, I read these names, and like, I don't know where any of those places are. That's fine. The reason that these place names are here is because at the time that they were written, they still knew where those places were. And what this does is gives us a hint into the validity of the text. Because it's not just they went south and came to a city. But this is a record of what happened from one place to the other, to give some validity, to show that this thing actually happened. They come safely to this place in the land of Canaan. On his way from Padan Aram, he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. And there he had erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel, which is God, the God of Israel. Now, he goes to this place, and what he does is really significant, and we're going to miss a lot of it. But I just want to point out a couple of things to you. First of all, it's important that he bought the land, okay? Because if he just camped somewhere, which you could do, you could just camp somewhere and it wouldn't be anybody's land. But if you camp somewhere and build an altar, that altar can be torn up by the next person that comes through. He wanted that to be a permanent monument passed down from his family, one generation to the next. A permanent place of worship. A permanent memorial for what God had done for him. The second thing that he does is he names it El Elohe Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. And when we think Israel, we think nation of Israel, we think Middle East, we think those kinds of things. His name is Israel. God had changed his name to Israel. Almost every time that Jacob talks about God, throughout these chapters that he's read, what does he say? He says, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of my fathers. But when he gets home, when God has kept his promise to bring him back and to take care of him, he says, this isn't the God of Abraham, this isn't the God of Isaac, this is my God. He's my God. I'm not going to have another God. I'm going to worship him and him alone, and I want everybody around to know that the God, the true God, the one that has carried me from place to place, the one that is real, that I've spoken to, that has done this, he is my God. And you can worship him here. He makes this declaration of faith that he's not my parents' God, he's my God. And he says, I'm not going to let anybody else mess this up. This is my land that no one will take from me or my family, and here we will worship the God of Israel. And that is the anticlimactic end to the moment he is dreaded for 20 years, the moment he lost sleep over for 20 years, the moment that kept him away from his parents for 20 years, the moment that kept him away when his mom was sick and died for 20 years is over, just like that. There are things that you know you need to do that you are not doing because you're so afraid of the worst case scenario that you will choose to disobey God in order to do them, in order to not do them. We're going to do conversations in just a minute. There are people that you know you need to share the gospel with, and you are choosing not to do it. Why? Because you're afraid of what they're going to say, you're afraid of how they're going to react, you're afraid you're going to mess it up. It all goes back to fear. I'm afraid of what HR is going to do, I'm afraid of what's going to happen, I'm afraid of how this is going to work. You're afraid, and you will not trust God in this thing. The worst case scenario is the least likely event that's going to occur. But I can't guarantee it's not going to be the worst case scenario. I can't guarantee that it's not going to be everything you dreamed of and more. Everything you had nightmares about and more. How about that? I can't guarantee that, but what I can tell you is almost every time it works out way better than you think it's going to. But what I can guarantee is that you will not make it better by disobeying God. I don't know how it's going to play out. I don't know how that conversation is going to go. I don't know if you're going to lose that friend. I don't know if you're going to get in trouble with HR. I don't know if you're going to get fired. I don't know any of those things. But I know that you have a God that loves you, that sent his son to die on your behalf to rescue you. And if he tells you to do something, it's always going to be better for you to do it than for you to decide that you know better than him and to not do it. And he said, you need to share the gospel with that person. You are an ambassador for the Christ in this place, and you need to share the gospel. And it's time for you to stop telling God that you know better than him. It's probably not going to be as bad as you think it is. It's probably going to be a lot better because the thing is, God knows what's going to happen. He knows the other person. He knows how they're going to respond way better than you do. So stop disobeying God and do what he's leading you to do. Some of you need to take some steps to obey God in other things, and you're afraid to do them. You're afraid of what's going to happen. Like you know that you need to step out and be baptized. And you're so afraid that you're disobeying God in this. This is not a question. You've placed your faith in Jesus. You know that you need to take this step. You need to be baptized. You know that what you're doing in your relationship is not healthy and it's not okay. You know that what you're doing is a problem and you're afraid to stop it because you're afraid to lose them. You're afraid of what's going to happen. You're afraid of how it's going to work out. You're afraid of how it's going to look. You're afraid. I don't know what it is. Maybe there's people in the room that God is calling into ministry for you to step away from that really great job that you've got with that really great paycheck and step into ministry. Maybe that's what God is calling you to. Whatever it is that you're telling God no about because you're afraid, just be honest that the reason you're saying no is because you don't trust him. Because if you did trust him, you would take that step. There are some of us that need to have some conversations. You got family members that you can't get along with. You got people in your life that have offended you and that you're hurt by, or that you've offended because of something stupid you did years ago. And you are avoiding the conversation that you know God is leading you to. He's told you to forgive. He's told you to seek forgiveness. He's told you to reconcile. He's told you to seek reconciliation. This is not God speaking from the clouds. This is just basic scripture. And you know you need to do this, but you are terrified to do it. I want to give you some advice from the life of Jacob. Now, I don't like sermons that have like 6 things for you to remember, because you're not going to remember if I tell you 3 things to remember, okay? You're just not going to do it. I understand. That's the way it is. You got a lot going on in your life. I'm going to give you about 6 things from this story that you can do if you want to try to not have the worst case scenario, okay? But instead of expecting you to remember this, here's what we've done. Those little circles in front of your chair, if you will tap those with your phone or scan that QR code, it's going to take you to a web page, and it's got a little graphic on it. It's got all 6 of these. You can take a screenshot, you can download it, you can save it. So if you want to save these things, you can. Or you can just write it down or text it to yourself or whatever. But I want to make it as easy as possible for you to have those things. What are the things that we can learn from what Jacob did that can help us not have the worst case scenario? First of all, you can be generous. And I don't mean give somebody 580 pieces of livestock. If you want to give me 580 pieces of livestock, I'm going to have to figure some things out, but I'll take it. But that's not what I'm talking about, okay? We'll get it worked out. Don't worry. We'll figure this out. I don't know what I'm doing with the camels, but the rest of it we'll figure out. But the generosity did not just come from, here's a bunch of money, here's a bunch of livestock to make you wealthy. The generosity came from letting go of claims that they'd been fighting about. The generosity came from saying, you know what, I know that we have had this inheritance issue that we've been arguing about for a long time. I'm just going to let it go. I'm going to give it to you. Be generous with them. Be generous with the grace that you extend. Be generous with the forgiveness that you extend. Be generous with what you call them on, what you don't call them on. Be generous. Because if you will be generous to people, then things are going to go a lot better than if you decide you're just going to walk in and we're going to make things right and we're all going to keep our chips on the side of the table, our side of the table, and we're not going to talk about any of that stuff. When Jacob and Esau got together, there's all these inheritance issues that they've been fighting over. And Jacob says, you know what? I'm not going to fight over that stuff. In fact, I'm not even going to bring it up. And I'm going to let you stay with mom and dad so that you can continue to live the life that you've been living. I'm going to do my thing over here. I'm going to be okay without that. And when it comes time, we'll work all that out. But for right now, this is not an issue we're going to fight about. You want to be able to have this conversation and it not be the worst case scenario? Be generous. Second thing is you need to show that you value the relationship. Show that you value the relationship. So many times, and this happens in churches a lot, that people get mad at each other, and so they get mad at each other and they stop the relationship. But anytime 2 people show that they value the relationship, they can get through it. They can get through it and they can work it out. If you don't value the relationship, I don't know why you're still pursuing this. But if you do value the relationship, show them that. How do you show them that you value the relationship? There's this one trick that I learned a long time ago, and it's really helpful. What you do is you say the words that you're thinking to them. Right? No, I don't want to do that. I want to do some hand gestures or something that indicate that I value the relationship. I don't want to do that sappy stuff. Say, man, I love you, and I miss you, and I know that we've got some history to work through, but I want you back. The most effective way that you can show somebody you value the relationship is by using words to say, I value the relationship. Jacob was too manly to do that. So what he did instead is he said, seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. But he showed that he valued the relationship. You want people to not fly off the handle. You want them to not pursue the worst case scenario. Show them that you love them. Show them that you value the relationship. Just say the words. And I'm promising you, the difference it will make will blow your mind. Be generous. Show that you value the relationship. Accept your share of the blame first. There are a few cases where somebody did something to you and you were completely innocent and you were completely right. There are a few of those. Those do exist. But for most of us, they may have the larger share of the blame, but we got a chunk of the blame for ourselves too. And if you want them to own up for their share of the blame, if you want to get past this, go first. Admit what you did explicitly. Don't do any of this, I'm sorry if I hurt. No. Admit what you did, apologize for it, ask for forgiveness. Do what you want them to do. Because it's really hard to come at somebody when they walk in being generous, telling you they love you and value the relationship, and admitting to what they did that was wrong. You got kids you can't get along with? Start by apologizing for whatever it was. Whatever part that you played in it, well, it's their fault, it's his fault, it's mom's fault, it's dad. Apologize for your part in it. And they might do the same. They might not do the same. But you're not doing it to get them to do it back. You're doing it because you love them and you want to make things right. Accept your share of the blame. Give grace. Grace is undeserved favor. That is, you receive something that you do not deserve. This is what Jesus has done for us. While we were still in sin, before I'd even started sinning, with all my sin of my entire life before me, Jesus died for me and offered me forgiveness. Because I was on my way to hell because of my sin. But what Jesus did is He came, He lived a life I could not live. He died a death He did not deserve, and He offered that death to me as payment for my death. That I could use His death in place of mine. Then He came back to life, and He offered me that same resurrection so that I might not just have my debt paid for, but live again. He did that. Did I deserve any of that? No. Not a bit. But He extended it anyway. You have been shown grace. Show grace in return. That you don't understand what they did. I don't care what they did. Honestly, I don't. I don't want to get into that. I know it hurts you. I know it hurts you deeply. And when I say I don't care, I don't mean that I don't have feelings for you. I don't have empathy for you. I mean it's not an excuse. You have been shown grace. You have been commanded to show grace. Do you want them back? Show grace. Give them grace. Give them what they don't deserve. Give them compassion and forgiveness that they have not earned. Extend it because it's been extended to you. This is more after you've had the conversation, but one of the most emotionally intelligent things that Jacob did in this whole process was once the relationship was restored, he set boundaries that would prevent the problem from occurring again. He said, this is the line that I'm going to be at, and we're going to have some distance here. If you value that relationship and you get that relationship back, set some boundaries. We've got these friends that we go spend a week with every year. Some of our best friends love spending time with them. But it always comes down to the money thing, right? We got to divide up the expenses, got to do it with the money. And it was really awkward at first when we would do that because we're working out money with friends, and that was really awkward. And we just had to make a decision that we valued each other too much to not handle this correctly. Because if one person said, well, we'll just do our share, like they got the Airbnb and we got the groceries, so they're just going to do that share and we're going to do ours, and it's always less. And if we continue with that, if we do that and continue with that, we're not going to have each other. So we said this is an awkward conversation, but we're going to have this conversation every time. What did you spend? What did I spend? How do we meet in the middle? And we do this weird business transaction in the middle of our friendship. Why? Because we want to still have the friendship when we're done. There are some conversations you need to have about boundaries with your family, like, Mom, I love you, but you cannot do this. If we're going to continue to get along, if you want to keep the grandkids, this is the line you don't get to cross. And you know what? I'm going to give some grace. When you're at their house, I know that some things are going to be different. I know bedtimes are going to be different. I know chocolate is going to be different. I know those things are going to be different. But here's the line I'm going to ask you not to cross. And I will give some, and you give some, and we'll set this boundary, and we'll be okay. But if you want to protect the relationship, you have got to draw some boundaries. And that is not, people look at these boundaries and are like, it's unloving to have boundaries. It's rude to have boundaries. It's impolite to have boundaries. Setting a boundary around a relationship that you care about is the most loving thing you can do because it protects that relationship. So once you've had the conversation, once the air's been let out of the balloon and you realize it wasn't that big of a deal in the first place, you don't want to go back there. Draw some boundaries. But here's the last thing that I want you to do. The last thing that you can do that you can learn from Jacob is to give credit to God when you get done. Right? You know this scenario. You dread something for weeks. You dread something for months. You dread it for years. And the whole time you're like, oh, God, please. Oh, God, please. Oh, God, please. You don't pray about anything else. It's just this. Please, God, please, 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 please. And then the air gets let out of the balloon. You realize it wasn't that big of a deal. And you go, and you move on. You don't take a minute to worship God for what He's just done. That He has taken this thing that was the focus of your entire life and made it okay. That He has taken something that you had no control over and He has moved in a way that only He can and resolved the issue. And you're like, that wasn't so bad. Take a minute to worship your God who has moved on your behalf and learn from it. Learn from it. That the next time that you're in the middle of this and you're disobeying God because you're afraid of what's going to happen, remember this moment. Remember how you obeyed God after a lot of delay, but you obeyed God and everything worked out great. Remember that and learn from it. Jacob, for all of his faults, he learned from his mistakes. He learned. He left his home and went to Laban, and honestly, he ended up being kind of a sucker because he learned from his lessons so well. Laban took advantage of him because he was trying to learn from those lessons. He ended up setting boundaries because of the lessons that he learned. He ended up protecting relationships because of the lessons that he learned. He made a ton of mistakes, but he learned from them. Don't let dread consume you for days, weeks, months, years. Have it resolved by God and then move on. Take a moment to worship the one who worked it out. Write it down. Make a piece of art. Cross-stitch it on a pillow. Do something to remind yourself for the next time. Because there will be a next time. And there's no reason for you to go through the dread, the disobedience, the fear that you went through this time. Learn that He is trustworthy. Learn that no matter if it does work out to the worst case scenario, it will not be made worse by trusting Him and obeying Him. Learn, worship, give Him the credit. I don't know what conversation it is that you need to have. I don't know if it's a conversation. I don't know if it's a step of obedience. I don't know if there's somebody that you need to share the gospel with. But I know that I am a person that puts off the things that I'm afraid of, even when God tells me to do it. That I assume I know better than He does. That I assume He is a bad father that would send me into the briars to get hurt. rather than remembering that He is a good Father that loves me and cares for me. And if He says now is the time, then now is the best time. I know that's how I am. And I have a feeling that's how you are. So here's what I'm going to challenge you to do today. If there's a step of obedience you need to take it. Take it. It'll be scary. It'll be fine. Take it. If there's someone you need to share the gospel with, I want you to find somebody else to tell. Husband, wife, friend, I don't care. Find somebody else and say, I know that I'm supposed to share the gospel with this person and I've not done it. I want to share the gospel with them this week. Call me on it. Ask me about it. Hold me accountable to it. Because if you just make a decision in this chair, singing this next song, if you just make this decision, you're not going to do it. But if you get somebody else to hold you accountable and you know they're going to ask you, you will. Third thing, if you've got a conversation that you need to have, I want to challenge you to do the same thing as you did with the gospel. I want you to find somebody and say, I need to have this conversation. I need you challenging me on this. I need you asking me about this because I have to do this thing. And let's see if next week, when we come back in here on Sunday of next week, 10 o'clock, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. I know creeks between here and where I live, but we should be all right. If we come back next week having taken steps of obedience, having shared the gospel, having had conversations that we need to have, I wonder how we worship next week. I wonder how we walk around with the weight of that off of us. I wonder who the new people are that walk around in the room with us. I wonder. I'd love to find out. But we only find out what would happen if you take a step of obedience. Not to me, but to God. What will you do? Stand with me, please. Our Heavenly Father, we come before you, and I'm so grateful for your patience with us. That you extend patience and grace, Lord, that you do not wait on us to deserve, but you give out of love because you value the relationship, because we were made in your image and made to reflect your glory, that we were made to have a relationship with you, and you value that relationship, Lord, that you have rescued us. And I ask that we would reflect that same attitude to other people. There are children that are estranged from their parents. There are parents that are estranged from their children. There are spouses that are not talking to each other. There are people who are not obeying you at work. There are people who have very basic steps of obedience that they need to take, that they're not taking, Lord, and you are patient with us through that. And I'm grateful. But I ask, Lord, that this week, that right now will be the time that we would make a commitment to trust you enough to obey, to trust you enough to share the gospel with that person that you've made us an ambassador to trust you enough to reconcile that relationship, even though we're scared of that conversation. Lord, I ask that you would help us, that you would give us courage, that you would give us wisdom, that you would give us faith. And that next week when we walk in these doors, we walk in lighter. That we walk in able to worship more because of the trust that we placed in you this week. That we walk in with those that we've shared the gospel with this week or invited into what we're doing here. I want to see that so badly next week, Lord. And I ask that you would give us what we need to take that step to see it through. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.